You've been lied to about the most famous financial crash in history. The story goes that 400 years ago, an entire nation lost its mind over a flower, that a single tulip bulb, a lump you'd mistake for an onion, sold for more than a house in Amsterdam, and that when the bubble finally burst, it dragged the whole Dutch economy down into ruin. It's the warning investors still repeat today, 4 centuries later. There's just one problem. Almost none of it actually happened. That legend, the nation gone insane, the ruined masses, the canals full of bankrupt men, is the go-to cautionary tale for every bubble since, from .com to crypto. But dig into the actual records, and the Dutch economy never crashed. Almost nobody was wiped out. The most feared financial mania in history was, in cold economic terms, barely an event at all. So, how did a story this exaggerated become gospel? To understand that, you have to understand what was really being bought and sold. Here's the plan. First, why a flower became worth more than gold. Second, the strange invention that let prices explode. Third, the crash that supposedly ruined a nation. And finally, the propaganda machine that turned a niche gamble into a national myth, and why that myth still costs people money today. Let's start with the flower. Tulips arrived in Europe from the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s, and the Dutch fell hard for them. But they didn't fall for just any tulip. The flowers that drove people wild were the rare, broken tulips, petals slashed with vivid, flame-like streaks of a second color, no two ever quite alike. Ordinary solid-colored tulips were cheap. These looked like living jewels. And what no one understood at the time is that this beauty was actually a disease. The streaks were caused by a virus, spread from plant to plant by aphids, that attacked the pigment in the petals. Here's the cruel twist. The same virus that made the flower priceless also weakened the bulb, so infected plants grew slowly and produced very few offshoots. The most beautiful tulips were also the hardest to reproduce, beauty and scarcity built into the same sick bulb. And the cause stayed a total mystery for nearly 300 years. It wasn't identified as a virus until the 1920s. The most legendary of them all was the Semper Augustus, white petals streaked with deep crimson, like blood in snow. At its peak, a single Semper Augustus bulb reportedly sold for 10,000 guilders. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman at the time earned somewhere between 150 and 300 guilders in an entire year. So, one bulb could cost more than a fine merchant's house on the best canal in Amsterdam. Decades of a working man's wages buried in a single flower. And the trades could be genuinely surreal. One surviving record lists a single Viceroy bulb swapped for a haul that reads like a farm inventory. Bushels of wheat and rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 pigs, a dozen sheep, barrels of wine and beer, tons of butter, wheels of cheese, a bed with its linens, a suit of clothes, and a silver drinking cup, together worth about 2,500 guilders. People weren't buying a flower to enjoy it. They were buying a bet that someone else would pay even more for it tomorrow. There's one strange detail that tells you just how far this went. Because a tulip only blooms for a week or two and looks like a plain onion the rest of the year, buyers often couldn't even see what they were purchasing. So artists were hired to paint precise watercolor portraits of the rarest tulips, bound into books called tulip catalogs. Merchants would flip through paintings of flowers to decide which bulbs to buy, sometimes paying a fortune for the picture of a tulip they would never actually see bloom. In a way, the market ran on images of value long before any value ever came out of the ground. And that points to the real engine of the mania. Tulips bloom briefly and spend most of the year underground. So during the trading frenzy in the winter of 1636, the actual bulbs were literally buried in the dirt. Nobody was handing over flowers. Instead, they traded contracts, written promises to buy a bulb at a set price once it was dug up in the spring. The Dutch had a perfect word for this: Windhandel, the wind trade, because you were buying and selling nothing but air. And it didn't happen in banks or on any official exchange. It happened in the back rooms of taverns, in informal groups called colleges. Buyers and sellers would gather, settle prices with little chalk slates and set rituals, and every deal came with wine money and a small fee for the house. It was part auction, part drinking club, Ordinary weavers, bakers, and shopkeepers trading paper fortunes over beer. So, who was actually doing all this? Not the whole nation, but a wider slice of society than usual, and that's part of why it ran so hot. There may also have been a darker force pushing people toward reckless bets. In 1636, just as the tulip trade peaked, an outbreak of bubonic plague was sweeping through the Dutch cities. Haarlem, the very heart of the tulip trade, was hit especially hard. Some historians argue that with death everywhere, people had less reason to play it safe, that a population staring down the plague was more willing to gamble everything on a flower. Whether or not the fear of dying truly drove the frenzy, the timing is haunting. The wildest speculation happened in the towns where the graveyards were filling up. But here's the detail that changes everything. Those contracts were legally unenforceable. Dutch courts treated them as gambling debts, not real commerce. So if the price fell, a buyer could simply walk away and refuse to pay, and no judge would make him. The fortunes on paper were enormous, but they were promises nobody was truly obligated to keep. It was a casino where the chips couldn't actually be cashed. And that single fact is the key to everything that happened next. In February of 1637, at a routine bulb auction in Haarlem, something quiet and catastrophic happened. The buyers didn't show up. Or they showed and refused to bid. Word spread within days, and the logic of the whole market ran in reverse. If no one will pay tomorrow's higher price, then today's price is pure fantasy. The entire Tower of Promises came down, almost overnight. Prices didn't gently drift lower, they evaporated. A bulb worth thousands of guilders one week was worth almost nothing the next. But now, watch what didn't happen. Because the contracts were unenforceable, most of the people who owed those insane prices never actually paid them. There was a messy, bitter period of disputes. Eventually, the authorities stepped in. The town of Haarlem proposed a compromise, and buyers were allowed to tear up a contract by paying just 3.5% of the agreed price. Imagine owing 100 guilders and settling the whole thing for 3. Humiliating, yes. Ruinous? No. The Dutch Republic remained the richest, most powerful economy in Europe. There was no mass bankruptcy, no wave of suicides, no canals clogged with the bodies of ruined men. Which raises the real question. If the crash was this survivable, where did the terrifying legend come from? This is where a modern historian named Anne Goldgar comes in. She spent years in the actual archives, the notarial records, the real contracts, the real names and numbers behind the story, and what she found quietly demolished the myth. For one thing, the market was never the whole nation. It was a fairly small, interconnected circle of merchants and skilled craftsmen, many of whom already knew each other. Out of all of them, Goldgar could document fewer than 6 people who ended up in serious financial trouble, not thousands. Fewer than 6! But she found something deeper, too. The real damage wasn't about money, it was about trust. These deals were sealed on a handshake and a man's word, and when people started tearing up their promises, what actually cracked was the social fabric, the honor and reputation that Dutch business ran on. The panic was real. It just wasn't the financial apocalypse we've been sold. So why do we all believe the opposite? It started right after the crash, when Dutch moralists and satirists flooded the market with pamphlets, cautionary tales, warning that greed and vanity lead straight to ruin. These weren't news reports. They were sermons dressed up as journalism, propaganda with a moral. And then, 2 centuries later, the story got its most powerful megaphone. In 1841, a Scottish writer named Charles Mackay published a book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions in the Madness of Crowds. He scooped up those old pamphlets, took them at face value, and spun them into the dramatic tale we know today. A whole nation gone mad, fortunes destroyed, and the famous image of a sailor who supposedly ate a priceless bulb thinking it was an onion. Mackay's book became a bestseller that has never gone out of print, quoted by investors and economists for nearly 200 years. Almost everything the modern world thinks it knows about Tulip Mania traces back to him, and he was largely just repeating propaganda. And that's the part that still matters today. Every time a market gets frothy, .com, crypto, housing, AI, someone shouts Tulip Mania, wielding a myth as if it were hard data. But the real tulip story teaches something subtler and far more useful. Bubbles are real. People really do lose their heads. But the legends we build around them are often more exaggerated than the bubbles themselves, and a scary legend can mislead you just as badly as the hype ever could. So be as skeptical of the doom mongers as you are of the hype men. The truth usually lives somewhere in between. If you like history where the myth and the money don't match up, subscribe, because next time, we're telling the story of a single family that invented modern banking and used it to buy the loyalty of kings and popes. The Medici are coming.